Should you buy Far Cry 6? Far Cry 6 is very similar to past entries, but it's also incredibly different in a bunch of different ways when it comes to customization, storytelling, and just overall direction. I've always wanted Far Cry to take this kind of route, spicing up your character with a third-person perspective, as well as the addition of customization that was actually decently implemented to finally perfect that gameplay loop that everyone plays Far Cry 4. Is this the direction you guys wanted for the franchise? Let me know down below. There will be no spoilers in this review, and anything story-wise will be generalizations, so I can't spoil anything really. We'll be talking about presentation, narrative, soundtrack, and gameplay. Welcome to Classic Game Reviews. My name's Jack, and this is my Far Cry 6 review. Man, I couldn't believe how good Far Cry 6 looks. The trailers do not do Far Cry 6 justice at all. When you land on that beach and take a minute to breathe in those visuals with the sound of the sea in the background, it really is breathtaking.
You're breathtaking!
Visuals for other things like character models and textures as well as vehicles aren't great, which is confusing to me because of how much Far Cry 5 focus on those specific details, especially character models, so that's a slight downgrade. But honestly, it really didn't bother me at all, as the style of Far Cry 6 is what carries the presentation. You can really tell that this is Far Cry 6. Ubisoft have done a stellar job separating Far Cry 6 from the rest of the franchise when it comes to your choice of weapons and attire as well as vehicles. Everything from a presentation standpoint is incredibly unique for the franchise, and it did take me a few hours to adjust to these changes, but overall I think Far Cry 6 is easily the best looking Far Cry game ever released. The UI is about the same as other Far Cry games though. There is a lot of clutter, so it's much easier to go into your journal to find where your next mission is unless you want to go exploring, which I would recommend, but don't forget Far Cry 6 has a very long story and I have about an hour left I reckon. Ammo and health bars are easy to read and you always know when you're about to die, so the UI overall it's pretty good. Far Cry's never really had bad UI, at least since Far Cry 3, so thank God they didn't mess it up this time around. I am so conflicted on this story, or at least the way it's told. This is easily the best and worst Far Cry narrative I have played. Now I know that doesn't really help you out, so let me explain. Character work here is fantastic. I find myself connecting with more characters in Far Cry 6 than I had with all previous characters if you combine Far Cry 3, 4 and 5, so that really surprised me. It's clear a lot of time and care went into crafting the cutscenes, characters and how the story was going to be told, choosing to leave your character during major story moments. Freeing the camera, which is something that's never really been done before in a Far Cry game from what I can remember. This is both a good and negative thing. In previous Far Cry games, in order for the writers to tell the story they wanted, they had to put the player as close to the main villain as possible. But with Far Cry 6, your character called Danny has like 3 interactions with the main villain, Anton Castillo, through the entire game, and that's because of the freedom of the camera. You spend a lot of time away from your main character and with Anton and his son Diego, and while both performances are fantastic, the storytelling just feels very basic. Anton appears with his son every few hours for a 2-minute cutscene where Anton goes on a little rant about why he does what he does while he tries to reason with his son Diego, and it really is the same thing over and over again apart from one interaction between your main character and Anton. It's really Diego who gets the better character arc, and well, I think Ubisoft was so worried about the criticisms of their villains not getting enough screen time that they decided to force random cutscenes explaining exactly why Anton does what he does without any subtlety at all, and this is why I'm conflicted. Everything I just said is personal preference, and overall the narrative is probably the most consistent in terms of quality the franchise has ever seen, but I just feel like a great villain was wasted here. You have multiple groups spread across the map and your job is to recruit them, and each group has their own story lasting 3 to 4 hours depending on if you do side quests. This choice was actually pretty effective. It's the typical Far Cry formula. You meet a new group of rebels, join a group of rebels and deal with their trauma essentially, and I'm happy to say that this is the best it's ever been done in a Far Cry game. Locations for each story feel unique from one another, setting a new kind of tone every time, and stakes within these side plots, adding further quality to these missions. Voice acting is decent most of the time, but there are a few moments where you are pulled in by some of the side characters as their line delivery is pretty piss poor, but there are always some pretty bad voice actors in Far Cry games. It's not distracting enough for it to ruin the experience, but when it does happen, you do get a good laugh because of how bad it is. Overall, I just wanted a bit more creativity when it comes to the main villain's appearances, as he never really felt like he was there most of the time. But I wouldn't be surprised if the storytelling aspect was limited by the lockdowns of 2020 and further on, so overall I think the narrative is great. If you are enjoying this review or just like this content in general, smash that like button to let me know. Thank you. The soundtrack for Far Cry 6 is fantastic. It's got this new sound that I haven't really heard in a Far Cry game before, separating it from previous soundtracks, going less for a mystery and mystical feel and more into this dirty, rugged, almost traumatic feel to it. There is always a looming presence to the music, especially the OST with the beating drums in almost every track with a lot of noise. And while I'm not a musician, even I can tell there is something great here. Every track feels unique and yet the same, sticking with the tone and keeping me invested. I loved the soundtrack for Far Cry 6, offering some pleasure to my ears. I watch the opening titles for the game every time I boot it up just to hear the track Libertad because I love it so much. It's clear Pedro Brofman, I think that's how you pronounce it. He clearly didn't want the soundtrack to stand out necessarily, but to be in the background, looming over you like the presence of Anton watching your every move. I love this soundtrack, and it's the best soundtrack for a Far Cry game I have ever heard in my opinion. Peter Brofman, I think that's how you say his name, did a fantastic job here, and I can't wait to hear more of his music. Gameplay here is the best in the series, but there are some major issues like always when it comes to Far Cry gameplay. Gunplay is great, and there is a crazy amount of weapons here, from your trusty pistol to some genuinely creative weapons that I won't spoil. You also have a new weapon called a Supremo, which you can customize and is like a super move that you have to wait to power up, and it feels like the natural progression of the series as it slowly but surely gets more and more crazy to top the last game. As I said, weapons feel great and are incredibly easy to use as well as customize, but how you customize those weapons is very different this time around. You collect loot and unlock gunpowder through crates in enemy strongholds, or the crates spread throughout the map to eventually craft your upgrades like optical sights and suppressors, although I feel like it's unnecessarily complicated and may put players off from even customizing because there is a lot here, so I think I should just jump to it. Character customization is in full force with different options for your head, chest, legs and boots, all offering their own stats that you can change to your advantage, and these stats replace the traditional skill tree, so all of the upgrades you normally have to unlock in previous games you unlock almost immediately, and I personally like this change, although it can hinder the feeling of progression. But you're unlocking so many items all the time you hardly notice the lack of a skill tree. Why would this all be overwhelming? Well, I haven't even mentioned the base building mechanic, or the fact that you need specific ammo types for specific enemies, and your companion challenges. Far Cry 6 really throws everything it has at you right at the start, not really saving anything for the later sections, and I do actually like this. Far Cry 6 gives you the tools you need and sends you on your journey for you to discover the different intricacies of the gameplay yourself, and I think overall that was a good decision. Now, I did say it's not all great. If you have been a part of the channel for a while, you know what's coming. AI, or artificial intelligence, is absolutely awful. This is a Ubisoft game, so I knew going in it was going to have some pretty terrible AI, but Far Cry 6 is just too damn easy. The second rifle you unlock can genuinely one-tap pretty much any enemy in the game. I'm not kidding. Stealth is your best friend because the AI is too dumb to even notice you, and well, eventually you just want to make the game more difficult for yourself, so you ditch the overpowered guns and go for a more personal touch with your machete. It's a shame because no matter how many people criticize Ubisoft's terrible AI, Ubisoft never ever fixes it, and it's getting tiresome because it's the same thing with every game Ubisoft makes now. So the AI is pretty terrible. I'm sorry Ubisoft, but you nailed pretty much everything else with a few nitpicks here and there, but your AI is easily the worst part about Far Cry 6, and you really need to sort it out for whatever Far Cry game you have planned next. Main missions are pretty great, varying from your standard Far Cry gameplay to giant helicopter boss battles requiring multiple weapons to take them down, and these events can actually happen in the open world, so it can be quite terrifying at times. Side quests are okay, but they are the standard side quests you normally get in Far Cry games, only this time it's for characters you actually like. Far Cry 6 does lack that exploration feeling though. Everything does feel kind of forced into your face, like here's this specific place we have marked on your map for a special item. Why show me that on the map? Because now I'm just going to avoid exploring everything else and go directly to that location, taking the satisfaction out of finding this special weapon that I know everyone will have because you've directed everyone to it. Overall, a lot of my complaints are nitpicks, and it's very clear that a lot of care and time went into crafting Far Cry 6, but for some reason Ubisoft ignore AI. The story is pretty damn good, but told in a way that I wasn't really a fan of, and the soundtrack is absolutely fantastic, with the best visuals we've ever gotten in a Far Cry game. For the amount of content you get from Far Cry 6, I do think it's worth full price, but would highly recommend waiting for a sale if you're getting tired of the Far Cry formula. Thank you for watching.